So everyone's been asking for my comments on the recent Francis Chan message that was delivered on communion. I've been sick with the flu for this past week. I'm still sick, but feeling well enough that I decided to record this. I've just had a lot of requests, so I decided to do it. So here are my brief thoughts on what happened. If you don't know, Francis Chan, who is an evangelical pastor, though not currently pastoring a church, I believe. And here's the thing. I actually am not too familiar with Francis Chan. I know of his name. I know that he published some popular books, but I don't really follow a lot of kind of what's going on in mega churches or kind of popular evangelical preachers and things like that. It's just not where my time goes and where my interests lie. I just can't keep up with everything. So, I'm not that familiar with a lot of the major figures there, but I know of Francis Chan. I just can't tell you I'm by any means an expert. I haven't read his books. I haven't listened to any of his sermons. But people wanted my comments anyway. So all I'm commenting on is just what I heard in the clip. I can't comment on anything further in regards to his own ministry or anything like that. But so in the clip, he basically talks about how he has changed his view about communion. He expresses that he understands that communion should be the center of the church, and that there was a unified understanding of Holy Communion as the true body and blood of Christ for the first 1,500 years of the church, until there was a change, he says, 500 years prior to that, the time of the Reformation, where people started believing that communion was just a symbol. So in the midst of this discussion, I had a lot of thoughts that came into my head upon initially watching this video. One is that it really sounds like Francis Chan probably was listening to Roman Catholic apologists. I mean, it sounds like he's repeating some of the just very popular lines that Roman Catholic apologists cite. As if maybe he's been listening to Catholic Answers or something like that. There was even a citation of that, the divisions among Protestant. There are, 30,000 denominations, a number that's completely overblown, and this has been demonstrated many times to be a completely false number and way of counting what counts as denominations, to make it sound like the division is so much worse than it actually is. So you can just do a Google search. I mean, there are a bunch of articles written dealing with where this number came from and why the number really doesn't work and should be used. Even a lot of Roman Catholic apologists recognize that they can't use that number, honestly. So that was kind of an odd thing, which just made me question kind of how much time and how much thought Francis Chan really put into this. I was kind of surprised that someone who was so educated or so popular would seemingly be that uneducated in regards to church history, as if, and he kind of divides up church history as if what everyone believed before the Reformation was that Holy Communion is the true body and blood of Christ, and then 500 years ago the Protestants believe that it's just symbolic. And I'm not sure how accurate either of those statements are. In terms of the first statement, it's kind of just a simplistic way of expressing it. Now, I never come to the point of saying, everyone believed this, because it's hard to make a statement that everyone believed anything, because you're always going to find those people who do have dissenting opinions or did have dissenting opinions. So regarding the supper, I think, I've used the argument before in terms of the real presence that there is this testimony in the history of the church that this is the opinion of the church. I mean, it's certainly the majority opinion that something miraculous is happening in the supper. This is not a symbolic action, but this is the body and blood of Christ. But you can't be so simplistic as to say, well, there was just one view of that in the beginning of the church, and then the Reformation changed it. There are, particularly in the West, there are multiple debates in terms of what it means that it's the body and blood of Christ. You have a 9th century debate between Ratramnus and Radbertus. And then you have Berengar of Tours, that's 11th century. So, and there's a debate surrounding that. He basically has a more Calvin kind of view of the supper. So it's not that there were no alternate opinions. Some people have also argued, by the way, that Tertullian had a more symbolic view of the supper. I don't know that that's the case. Tertullian's not really the church father, if he's considered a church father, because he's not, because of his Montanism. But Tertullian is not one that I've spent as much time reading, so I can't give a particularly informed opinion about that. But it certainly is the case that it is the majority view. But I think it's wrong if you give the impression that there was complete unanimity on this question as a whole throughout that time period. And then the second part of this is rather simplistic as well, because it gives the idea that, well, then at the Reformation, there's just the view that it's only symbolic. And looks like Francis Chan went to Master's Seminary, which is John MacArthur's seminary. So I'd assume that Master's Seminary probably does promote a purely symbolic view. But in terms of the Reformation, there were several different views of the supper. And of course, as a Lutheran, I believe that it is the true body and blood of Christ. So I'm in agreement with what Chan is saying. And so I'm in that way, I'm appreciative that he's come to these conclusions. But there are alternate views in the Reformation as well. There's the Calvinist view, which is a little different from, very different from the Lutheran view and from the purely symbolic view. Now, of course, I'm glad that he is coming to an understanding that it is the body and blood of Christ. But the way that those divisions are presented, I'm not convinced is really that fair or honest or really nuanced in how these things are being spoken about and how they're being dealt with here. And so the other thing that I want to get at, the other thing that he really mentions here, which is good, is that he speaks against what has happened in a lot of popular American evangelicalism, particularly megachurches, and this is where Chan himself got his popularity. And what he criticizes is the idea that the preacher himself is at the center of the church. And so Christians surround different figures. So, someone's like I listen to John Piper, I listen to John MacArthur, I listen to Francis Chan or whatever major popular preacher is the one that you cling on to the most. And the church surrounds the pastor and their exposition of a scriptural text more than it does Christ himself. And so what Chan sees and expresses rightly here, and this is good, is that the Lord's Supper is really the thing that unites us, because this is where we come to church not to hear a specific pastor, not because we like the guy who's in the pulpit, but we come to receive the body and blood of Christ. So we come to church because of the presence of Christ. This is one of the things I've always appreciated about vestments, is part of the purpose of the pastor wearing vestments is it hides the pastor, because the vestments are a reminder of the person, whoever is wearing these things. He's in that pulpit, he's at the altar because of his office and because God has ordained that office and put this man into that office. But it's God's working through the office of the ministry that is important, not whoever that particular guy is. And so when you're, going into the pulpit, which is front and center of, your sanctuary, and the pastor kind of wears and does whatever he wants, and the sermon is basically the entire service, everything is kind of shaped around the individual. And so the liturgical service and the use of vestments and the centrality of the Lord's Supper, all of these things do decentralize the pastor and say, we are gathered here because of Christ. We are gathered here to receive his love, his forgiveness, his true body and blood, his word, his sacrament. So that is really good correction to where a lot of the kind of megachurch stuff is at and still remains at. The interesting thing about that is that people are only talking about this clip because Chan is that. Chan is one of those guys that people follow and say, I follow Chan, and are really interested in what he has to say. So he's criticizing this thing, but the reason why this whole clip has gotten popular at all is because of the thing that he's criticizing. So it's a little odd how exactly that plays itself out. And I think a lot of the problems that he's getting at really are resolved by being part of what is a confessional tradition, because you're not within confessional Lutheranism. It's not going to be just, the individual pastor's theology. And then you have the fear that, well, when the next pastor comes in, maybe his theology is going to be totally different. Or, because there is this unifying confession, that is the Book of Concord, this is not just up to the individual pastor to do what they want to do. And even if the pastor's sermon is not very good that day, you have the divine liturgy and you have the body and blood of Christ, which remain good and true regardless of how bad the pastor's sermon was that day. This is one of the things that's very assuring in preaching when you're in a liturgical service. Is, well, even if I mess the whole thing up, Christ is still present and God's word is still present and the Spirit is working through those things. Even if I have a kind of a bad day and my study, my interpretation of a particular passage wasn't very good, God is still at work in these ways. And I think so Chan is seeing the benefits positively of some of those things. So, overall, people have asked my opinion because, they think I'd be, excited that someone coming from evangelicalism or a major figure is now affirming the real presence of Christ's body and blood. And yeah, I am excited about that. I think that's really great. I don't say that as someone who's that familiar with Chan, so I don't know. It probably doesn't connect with me as much as some other people it might. But at the same time, I have concerns in that the whole thing just doesn't sound like it was really thought through very well. And so I want people to have to believe this, of course, but I want to make sure he's really thinking through things thoroughly. And this explanation just has me thinking that maybe he's been listening to some Roman Catholic apologists and maybe is going in that direction. I don't know. I don't know enough, but it certainly sounds that way to me. But I don't think he needs to go that way. I would love to see him as a confessional Lutheran. I'd be happy to talk to him about confessional Lutheran theology. If that's the case, that he would be interested in that for whatever reason. But so I guess we'll just kind of see where it goes from this point forward. So anyway, those are very brief thoughts. I have the flu, like I said, so I can't tell you that maybe, I'll look back on this and be like, I don't know what I was talking about. So hopefully I made some kind of coherent sense. So anyway, I'll see you guys in the next video. God bless.